today, we're going to look at New Code NLP in outline, which you're all about to come on to anyway. And then we look at timelines. Is that okay?
Yeah. Good.
So let's think about New Code NLP. Have you read anything about it?
I watched a little video with Grinder yesterday,
Right.
And he was just talking about that the structure of magic wasn't written with that in mind, and that it's more listening to the unconscious,
Yes.
and taking that as a forefront of the decision making, something like that.
Yes, exactly. Grinder moved away from Bandler for some years, and then went to work in different ways. And then a number of years ago, he wrote a book called Whispering in the Wind with his partner, Carmen Bostick Sinclair. And in that book, he outlined what he called New Code NLP. Now, okay, if you step back and think about this potentially cynically or skeptically, it was a thing he wanted to market, as NLP's gone through loads of different iterations. When Bandler found that they couldn't trademark NLP because it was a generative thing, it meant that they had to come up with new marketing tags. This is me being very cynical, and I don't mean to be. So, Bandler created design human engineering as one of his tags, and of course, Grinder just carried on doing what he was doing, and then came up with this New Code. Cynicism aside, however, each one of those techniques and approaches did bring something new to the field. And NLP is based upon a couple of core processes. The fast phobia is one of those core processes, but the other one is a 6-step reframe, which was the core process. And there's a problem with the 6-step reframe, which you may have encountered while you were playing with it. What do you think the problem is? I mean, you've kind of hit on it in a way, but...
What I understand them is that they asked they've reduced it down to 3 questions, like you've got 3 options of behaving differently, rather than 8 ways of behaving differently.
Yeah. Okay, so there's still a problem with creating the options. Keep going. You're there nearly. Okay, let's review the 6-step reframe. The 6 steps are, that kind of identify the state, identify the ideomotor response, identify the unconscious part that drives that state, then get the unconscious part to tell you of a number of different options it can do instead. And that's the problem. Because to articulate solutions to a problem you've not really thought about involves a lot of cognitive load. And people get stuck. They sit there and go, I don't know, I can't think of anything to do. And in an initial traditional 6-step reframe, the idea is the unconscious will provide it if you give it time. Right? And what Grinder decided was, is there some way we can cut out that completely, where we don't have to get the unconscious to work that hard to think about alternatives? Right? Does that make sense? So you're right. New Code does something rather interesting, and we'll try and do a few examples of it. New Code suggests that we can have the problem state, whatever it is, and we can have a neutral state, what Grinder called the know-nothing state. It's actually, when I did this because I did train with this with Grinder, for me, he was talking about what the Buddhists would call mindfulness. Present moment. Right. That's why this bit of work is in that unit with the mindfulness states. So the no mind state is a state where you're totally present and nothing is getting in the way. You're not anxious about anything. You're not planning anything. You're not trying to track any thoughts or problems. You're not even working at it. And then what you do, in simple terms, is you take the no mind state to the problem state and let the person quietly resolve the two. You collapse anchor those two things. Yeah? Which all sounds great, except you've got to get people who aren't mindful meditators into a no mind state.
Because it takes practice.
Because it takes
It
practice. And if you've ever done any mindfulness, you know yourself, you can do your square breathing to the heart's content, but that thought bubble lamp is producing stuff that takes you off task. So the challenge that Grinda had was to produce the no mind state in a therapeutic situation where the person may not have done any mindfulness training at all. And so what they came up with was a series of games. And these games can be as varied as you like. There needs to be a couple of things about the games. One is they've got to produce a rhythm and an automatic response that they're not thinking about. And the second is they've got to be things that the person can't lose at. They've got to remove all that kind of idea of performance from it. So they're not trying to perform and win the game, they're just doing it. Okay, does this make sense?
Yeah.
So we're now left with what kind of games we could play. Sidebar, a guy called Michele Csikszentmihalyi, don't ask me to spell it, right, wrote a book called Psychology of Flow a number of years ago, and flow states have been popularized ever since. And what a flow state is basically when you're doing something with a no mind attitude, you're just in it, you're in the zone. We call it being in the zone. But the flow has certain things to it that make it work. In a learning sense, the flow has a task that is where the person doing the task feels they can achieve, but they don't feel it's boring or beneath them, right? They're in the flow. You've experienced the flow. You've probably read a book and you've been so into the book that time has gone. That's the flow. Sports people get into the flow before an event. You see them rehearsing mentally and then they're just there. And it's in fact, I would recommend, if you've not read The Flow by Csikszentmihalyi, have a read of it.
Is it called The Flow?
It's called The Flow, but just if you put flow psychology down, you will find the spelling of Michele Csikszentmihalyi. I can say it, but I can't spell it. And anything that he's written is really worth a look. Because when he came up with this, he came from a sports psychology background, I believe, and then he applied it to business and applied it to productivity and applied it to therapy, and so there's lots of applications for it. So we need to create a flow or no mind state. So I'm going to give you some of the games that Grinda used to play, and then we can talk about which ones that you might not talk about the games that I played, and then we'll go through it. The first game that Grinda taught us on the new code stuff was ball toss, right? And I forgot to bring some to throw. And that's simply where you're playing catch, right? However, the way you play catch, and this is where there's a problem because you can't necessarily do this with just you. The way that we played it was there was the person being coached, and then there were people flanking that person, and a third person who was the coach. And the person to the left would toss the ball in such a way that that person would catch it. They would throw it to this person, who would then throw it back, and then throw it to that way. So the rhythm is throw, catch, throw, catch, throw, catch. And the idea would be that the coach who was observing it would be watching for the non-verbals, watching for the calibrating, so they knew when this person was doing this in a natural flow state. Now, it can take some time to get people into that, because every time they drop the ball, they have to start again, because they're now worried about dropping the ball. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
But it really is powerful, and people who've never really done any mindfulness stuff, when they get the idea that there's a flow to this and it's gentle, right? They do, and you can see when they change, they flip from thinking about it to just doing it. Yeah. And so ball toss is one way, but it requires